This is Chapter 5 on interest groups. We start with the first question: why are interest groups so important in American society, or American politics, I should say? For one thing, they've replaced the political parties in the conduct of campaigns. If you go back to the 1940s, 1950s in particular, it starts to change in the 1960s. Political parties were a lot more important in politics than they are now. Now they just seem to provide labels for candidates. But in the old days, they were the organization, essentially before television, something we'll talk about later. They were responsible for the conduct of the campaign. In other words, they provided workers that went door to door, passed out literature, talked about the candidates, that kind of thing. You see it to some degree, that kind of politics you see to some degree going on in small places. You'll even see it in the presidential primaries in places like New Hampshire and Iowa, if it's covered on television. But anyway, political parties used to be involved in all aspects of the campaign: financing, conducting the campaign in the sense of going around and knocking on doors and passing out literature, even nominating the candidates. Today, candidates are self-nominated, but in the old days, the parties used to pick somebody. Maybe we'll talk more about that when we get to the political parties chapter. Anyway, that function, all those functions that I just mentioned, are covered now by interest groups. They're actually involved extensively in all those things in place of the political parties. And so that's one of the reasons why they're so important in American politics. They're replacing political parties as the primary institution responsible for the conduct of election campaigns. The second thing is they dominate the contact with public officials. Public officials spend a considerable amount of time trying to gauge public opinion to know what people think about the issues. They do that in public meetings, they do that with letters, they do that with speeches, all kinds of ways in which they go around trying to figure out what people want. And that time, the time they're doing where they talk to people, it's dominated by interest groups. So most of what they hear, most of what they think, most of what they see has to do with what interest groups want them to see and hear and think. The average person never meets with a public official. Just think of how many times you or your family has met a congressman or a senator or a presidential candidate. Very few of us have ever experienced that, but interest group people do it all the time. Number three is they provide a way to organize the public. Again, this is something that the parties used to do. They used to represent, the Democrats used to represent sort of the liberal points of view on the issues, whether that's abortion or gay rights or what, any, foreign policy issues, whatever. The parties used to be the ones to stand for those things, and then you lined yourself up as a Democrat or Republican, depending on which issues you were closest to or what party you were closest to. Today, that function is provided by interest groups. If you're a gun person, you belong to the National Rifle Association, and if you're opposed to drunk driving, you belong to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and if you're for unions, you belong to some union group or some group that supports unions, that kind of thing. Anyway, it's interest groups that are representing, to the extent that it's done anymore, they're representing the public in some organized fashion. Another thing that makes them very important is they use tactics that work. Most of us think about the tactics like, what can we do as a citizen, is to do things like protesting or voting or writing our representative, that kind of thing. But the tactics that really work are the tactics that are used by interest groups, and we'll be talking about those in a couple of minutes here. Another thing that they're able to do now in the 21st century is they're able to write legislation. It's supposed to be that only members of Congress write legislation. Only members of Congress are on the floor. Nobody else can get there when they're discussing an issue, um, only the members, whether it's the Senate or House of Representatives, only the members are able to interact with each other. But that's only in a formal sense when they're in floor debate. The rest of the time, interest groups are there, and interest groups are in their office, and interest groups are handing them things that they want written into legislation, or legislation itself that they want written. So nowadays, oftentimes, the legislation is written by representatives of the most powerful interest groups. So energy policy is written by, essentially by interest groups in the energy field, electric companies, Standard Oil, Mobil, all that kind of stuff. Another thing is they can influence public opinion by using think tanks and front groups. I'm going to mention here, think tanks are organizations that are put together. Oftentimes they're made up of intellectuals, college people, college professors who take leave of absences and go work in these organizations, where what they do is they do studies and they try to promote knowledge about public issues, or try to come up with answers for public officials about issues. Like, for example, the problem of Social Security is that there's a sense that the baby boomers are all going to hit the Social Security system at the same time, because there's this huge number of people that were born after the Second World War, and that they are going to now be retiring, and they're going to flood the system so that there won't be enough money to go around for everybody. So think tanks would try to come up with alternative answers as to how the government could get the money to support all these people that are retiring. And the other thing that interest groups do is they are out there with front organizations, rather than say this advertisement or this idea that's presented in an ad is sponsored by the oil companies or the utility company or something like that, companies that don't have really very good reputations with the public. In order for them to be believed, they will put up a front organization. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here. But so they're using, nowadays, it used to be in the old days when you had the RAND Corporation, the Brookings Institute, think tanks like that. What they did was they genuinely studied issues. They weren't advocates. They were like academics that do studies where they don't really take a point of view. They just tell you what the study found. And that's the critical thing. They didn't approach it with a bias. But nowadays, think tanks are political. They're very, very political, and they're very, very oriented toward specific interest groups and the Democratic and Republican Party. And so, essentially their views cannot be trusted, their studies cannot be trusted, but they have a sense of legitimacy because most people don't know that. Most people aren't at all aware of the think tank, of the front groups either. So they don't know about that either, and that gives power to the interest groups. The last thing that makes them very, very powerful is that they are generally engaged in defensive strategy. So what does that mean? That means that they're trying to protect what they have. They're not trying to get new legislation passed. The political system, as we'll talk about when we get to Congress, the system is bent in favor of those on defense. That is, those who are not trying to change things, but just trying to keep things the way they are. The Founding Fathers and the Constitution, both written and unwritten, tend to favor a position of not passing new legislation. So if you advocate something like reforming the medical system in the United States with some sort of socialized medicine system where the government pays for medical care for everybody, that is much, much harder to achieve than for the American Medical Association and the Hospital Association and everybody else to essentially keep the system the way it is. So that's what I mean by being on the defensive, to keep the system the way it is. Here's some examples of front organizations. You've got 60 Plus Association, which is a front for the Koch brothers. I don't know if you know them, but they're a right-wing political family with a lot of money, and they essentially um, support right-wing views. The second is the Center for Consumer Freedom. Nice name, but it really represents the restaurants, the alcohol people, selling alcoholic beverages like to restaurants and others in the tobacco industry. Another one is Citizens for Sensible Energy Policy. That's a front for power utility companies who, again, you give them a nice name, you give the organization a nice name, like Citizens for Sensible Energy Policy, and it's really just a front for the utility companies. We don't want to hear that Commonwealth Edison. People don't want to hear that Commonwealth Edison thinks what Commonwealth Edison thinks or what they want, because we know that their main line is the profits of Commonwealth Edison. So you put it up as a front, Citizens for Sensible Energy Policy, or Energy Choices, I should say, and it makes it look like it's just a group of normal people. Another one is Coalition for Health Insurance Choices, again, same kind of thing, and it's a front for the Insurance Association. Here's a link below here. They'll give you examples of different kinds of front organizations. There's a whole big list if you're interested in this topic. Here's an example of some think tanks. I got some liberal ones and conservative ones. You've got the and they're linked here. So if you're interested in looking at what these think tanks are about and what they look like online, you can just click on any of them. The three very famous liberal ones are the Brookings Institute. That's been around for a long time. So has the Council on Foreign Relations. The Brookings Institute has essentially dealt with domestic issues, Council on Foreign Relations, of course, foreign policy, United States foreign policy issues, and Human Rights Watch looks at things like abuse in countries of the individual citizens, like who's in jail for political purposes and things like that. And then on the conservative side, you've got the Cato Institute, Heartland Institute, Heritage Foundation. They've all been around since about the time of President Reagan. Again, especially on the conservative side, I would say they were formed with a very political agenda, and they promote that agenda by masquerading as experts and studies and things that you would normally get out of a academic. Second question is, what's the difference between public interest groups and a single interest group? Well, a public interest group is a group that represents consumers or the environment, or I use three examples here, and women. Essentially, they're very different from the usual interest group in that they pretend, or they purport, I should probably say, to represent large numbers of people. So say now a national organization of women would argue that they represent all women in American society. Consumer groups like Science and the Public Interest would argue that they represent consumers because they look at the safety of products. So public interest groups are more like, and at least in terms of their representation, they're more like political parties in that they have a broad umbrella of people that would be underneath them, whereas most interest groups, when we think about interest groups, you think about interest groups that represent a segment of the society, like representing doctors or lawyers or union members or teachers or something like that, very, very specific segment. Single interest groups represent a single issue. It's kind of the opposite of the public interest group. They represent single issues. Here are some examples: gun control, drunk driving, gay rights. So you have these groups, like say with gun control, you have a group that would simply be opposed to individuals having guns or interested in registering guns or having the sale of guns at conventions and group meetings of people who keep guns, to limit or um, make it unlawful to sell guns there, or not to sell automatic weapons. So you've got organizations that deal with that kind of stuff, or if you look at like drunk driving, you've got um, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. With that, is essentially their role is just to be concerned about the issue of people who drink and drive, and trying to get laws that are stricter so that people who drink and drive are going to pay heavy penalties for that. Here's an example of an ad for an interest group that deals with gun control. So let's get to the third question, which what are the tactics used by interest groups? Now, I divide tactics into two categories. One, and you won't really see this in the book. You see the tactics discussed, but you won't see them divided like this. I divide it into elite tactics and non-elite tactics. Elite groups are groups that have, first and foremost, they have money. The second thing they have is prestige. And the third thing is they have is organizational leadership. And money's pretty easy to understand. They're organizations that have as their members people who have a lot of money, and so they're able to collect a lot of money. So that's easy enough to understand. What the prestige is pretty easy to understand too. In other words, in society, we recognize these organizations as something that we can believe in. Like for example, the organized crime and the mafia and the cartels and all that. They have a lot of money, but they don't have any prestige. So they couldn't come on television and say, hey, we're getting persecuted by the government here, because nobody would care. That's lack of prestige. But when the American Medical Association comes out and they say that some form of medical care, like Obamacare or something like that, is going to mess up the medical system and not allow you to see the doctor you want to see, that has significant influence because the American Medical Association has prestige. And the last thing is organizational leadership, to define elite groups. And organizational leadership is to be smart enough to know what tactics to use and how to use it so you don't waste your money. Sometimes even elite type groups will waste their money. Like for example, way back in the 1950s, the AFL-CIO, largest labor union at the time, decided that they wanted to take over the Democratic Party and run their own candidates as Democrats. So they wanted union members to become candidates for all the different offices, so they would dominate Congress. And they were pretty successful in dominating the Democratic Party, and they spent millions of dollars at the time on that strategy, but they were not able to be successful in electing those people. So that was a lack of organizational leadership. So you gotta have money, you gotta have prestige, but you gotta also know how to use it and to use it wisely. And that's where the organizational leadership comes in. So anyway, that's what I mean by elite groups, and they use the following tactics: public relations, electioneering, lobbying, and litigation. Now, the main thing that's used, the most successful things that are used are the two in the middle. Electioneering, which means getting involved in political campaigns. They do it in two ways. One is by donating money to candidates, and the other is by putting on independent commercials that benefit a candidate but don't say they're on behalf of the candidate. So I see in Illinois that there's Senator Kerr is running for Senate again, and there's these ads that appear in my newspaper when I read the Chicago Sun-Times that say that, that are negative about him. I forget exactly what they're criticizing, but anyway, it's not important. What's important is that the ad is not put on by Democrats or Republicans. It's paid for by an interest group. So that would be the kind of thing that would be under the label of public relations. And usually, most interest groups, what they do when they put ads on television that you see, um, is when they're political ads, they're either promoting the the organization, the interest group. They're promoting the interest group as trying to build up its prestige, or they're advocating for a particular issue. That's usually what they do. During election campaigns, they also do these independent ads, which result from, from promoting either a Democrat or Republican. And they're all doing it nowadays because the Supreme Court said it's legal. So that's where you see them. So essentially, when we talk about public relations, we're talking about television ads. Could be radio ads and other media ads as well, but mostly it's television. And it's promoting the status or image of the organization. Like, for example, Commonwealth Edison used to do a lot of this when we lived in Illinois. They had ads where they would show like a person working for the company going up a pole during an emergency storm to restore the electricity for a group of people, a neighborhood or something that lost its electricity in a storm. And then as the person comes down the ladder, there's somebody standing there at the bottom of the pole with a cup of coffee, and how grateful we are to Commonwealth Edison. And usually when you see these kind of ads, what it amounts to is that the status of the organization is going down for some particular reason. Like, for example, with the Commonwealth Edison at the time of the ad I'm talking about, was that they were charging the highest rates in the country, so the highest electrical rates in the country, and that was pretty negative. So they're trying to build up their status. The other thing would be like the oil companies. I used to see ads when I lived in Chicago and read the Tribune. They would have ads in there every Sunday advocating by the oil companies to be drilling in the public lands, like in Alaska, the wildlife areas, to be able to drill there, so we wouldn't be, their excuse was we wouldn't be relying on foreign oil. Okay, so that's public relations. Electioneering, getting involved in campaigns. Lobbying, you probably know about. That's going before the legislature and presenting your point of view. You can do it in committee, you can do it in writing, you can do it in person, just talking to people. There's another area called social lobbying, where you do favors for people. It's pretty much bribery, but it's sort of legal bribery, where you allow them to take a ride on your plane, or you let them use your condo in the Bahamas or something like that. All of that stuff is still mostly legal. And the last thing is litigation. That's going to court. Now, all of those things, like a court case where you sue a business sues the government, like with Obamacare, they were sued. Government is sued a number of times that it's not constitutional to require people to be in the system. So anyway, those are all elite tactics, and they all require money, for one thing. Nobody buys ads on television unless they've got a lot of money. Nobody would be contributing significantly to candidates if they didn't have a lot of money. Lobbying costs a lot of money, and then litigation, of course. Anybody who's ever been near a lawyer knows that it's all a lot of money. The non-elite tactics on the other side here on the right, I listed, are essentially demonstrations and boycotts and class action suits and direct action. Demonstrations, everybody knows what that is. You stand out in front of a building and hold up signs, that kind of thing. Boycotts are you refuse to buy products from companies that operate a certain way. the animal rights organizations that I belong to have always been involved in both of those things, demonstrations and boycotting. The reason most people in the animal rights movement today are vegan is not because that's the best diet. It only turned out to be the best diet many years later. It was done to boycott the people who were abusing animals, essentially farmers and dairy people and that sort of thing, and and then products that were made with animals. So yeah, demonstrations, boycotting, that's been a big thing. Us boycotting the circus, that everything seemed like it would always happen every year. So another thing would be class action suits, um, where one person can't afford to bring a suit against a company or against a government in some way, but if a whole bunch of people who are all been who all have been wronged by some issue or problem or something come together, they can afford to have the case. Direct action, when I think about that, I think mainly of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and people like that, where you kind of broke the law, in minor laws really, in an effort to bring attention to an issue. Like, for example, tying yourself together and blocking traffic, or refusing to allow people to go into a building. You see that with in areas like with the issue of abortion, where the anti-abortion people are protesting abortion clinics. And then the last one is, this is mine, this is my idea, you won't see it in the book, is scale down elite tactics. In other words, non-elites and non-elite groups is everybody who's not an elite, everybody doesn't have money and organizational leadership and status. They can perform some degree of the four things listed in the left column. Like public relations, they can't afford to do ads. They can't do ads on TV, but they can appear on TV. They can try to get free coverage on TV. Like, for example, Science in the Public Interest, they hold a news conference every year and tell us about things that are dangerous to eat or dangerous to buy, that sort of thing. And then they get covered on TV. There's a group, I forget the name right now, but they do the same thing with regard to children's toys right before Christmas. So they get covered in the media, and it's equivalent to some degree. It's somewhat equivalent of buying ads. Electioneering, people show up at somebody's campaign and they ask questions, or they demonstrate in front of the candidate, or they show support for the candidate. All of those kinds of things are part of electioneering, short of money. You could, like, organizations will volunteer to work for somebody, go door to door, that kind of thing. Lobbying, usually the scaled down version would be like you do it for one day, or you'd have people trained to go to the legislature, and you get a bus or something and take people there. Litigation, I mentioned the class action suits. That's about the closest thing you get to non-elites participating in an elite tactic. Here's a K Street. That's where in Washington D.C. where most of the interest groups have offices. Here's something you should know. It's not really a part of the answer to a question, but it's something you should know about interest groups, because one of the things that you see in the book is all this talk about, well, if there's so many interest groups, like K Street is, one group after another, all you got to do is look at the phone book in Washington D.C. and you look under interest groups, you just see pages and pages and pages, and so you'd say to yourself, as political scientists do, that these groups really must represent everybody, because there's so many of them, and that's an indication of the vibrancy of democracy. But I have a question, or an issue here, a caveat, if you will, on this, and that is that interest groups have an upper class bias. Almost everybody represented represents high higher ups, the people at the top. Why that's the case, I listed here, um, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, even organizations that, like I mentioned earlier, like women's groups, they say they represent all women, but they don't. They really represent the women. Like the main issue, and now for years and years, was the glass ceiling. Well, some woman who's scrubbing the floors doesn't give a damn about the glass ceiling. So you're not really representing her. Glass ceiling meaning that only men were given the highest positions in companies. Um, yeah, so that's was the case for a long time. Now it's starting to break a little bit. Men still dominate in most of the prestige positions, but women are starting to make some leeway, and maybe thanks to now. But the point being that they represent the elites, the upper class, the top women and their issues, not the women at the bottom. And you can say that about consumers and everything else. Anybody who's trying to represent everybody, they really don't represent the people at the bottom. In other words, the lower classes, the uneducated, the semi-skilled, the homeless people, et cetera, are not really represented in the same way that the elites are. And why is that the case? I listed some reasons here. Elites feel more of a need to organize. In other words, they have more to lose. So if they're threatened, like for example, doctors have had a really prestigious position in American society. Not only do we think highly of them in terms of what they do, they're making a contribution, etc., but that they're rewarded very well for that. They make um, hundreds of thousands of dollars in the process of being a doctor. Whereas if you go to some other countries, especially those that have some form of socialized medicine, doctors only make maybe a third or less of what doctors make here. Especially if you look at some place like Russia, where historically after World War II, where so many men were killed, doctors in Russia were mainly women and still are mainly women. They were never paid as high as many other occupations in the country. So that's the first thing, that they have elite status and they make a lot of money and everything, so they got more to lose. Number two is they're highly educated and they understand the system better. I think the more educated you are, the more likely you are to understand how the American political system works. And these organizations, I'm not saying that like every American doctor, because they've had an advanced degree, knows how the political system works. What I'm saying is that the American Medical Association and the doctors in that organization that represent them know how the political system works. Most Another thing about elites is that they have more leisure time to participate and they have more money to participate. So, as a poor student with a student loan, ask yourself, how many times have you contributed to political campaigns? Whose political campaign have you given money to? And the answer to that is probably none. And if you went around and asked most people, even people that are working, not just students, but people that are working, they would look at you pretty funny, to say, why would I be donating to those guys when they're taking my money, the government's taking my money, and there would be a lot of negative attitude about that. There was one time back in the I think it was in the early 80s, the Democratic Party was under bad times. The Republicans had won the presidency with President Nixon and then President Reagan. And so the Democratic Party put on a telethon and they tried to raise money. It was a complete disaster because unlike charities like muscular dystrophy that ran telethons for years and years and raised billions of dollars, these guys could barely raise any money because of the lack of prestige of the political parties in the system. So it really was a classic disaster. But anyway, people in elite elite status, have leisure time, and they have money to give, and they give it to the organizations that represent them. Another reason why the has an upper class bias is the interest groups have an upper class bias is that they don't have the numbers, and they'll be outvoted by the masses every time. So if they want to protect their interests, they've got to be in interest groups, and they know that. So doctors are never going to be able to, if all the doctors got together and they voted together, it's not going to amount to anything because they're just a small percentage of the population, and that would work for almost every single economic interest group. So they have to find another way, and they did find another way, which is to be represented in interest groups, which are going to lobby and be involved in electioneering and public relations, the things we just talked about. And then the last reason is they see results. Interest groups that see results are much more likely to be successful, whereas if you look at a lot of the groups, like environmental groups and gun control groups and so on, they're generally not very successful. Only the economic groups at the top are successful. I remember one time in my interest group class when I asked the Standard Oil representative to tell me what his batting average was, how many times he won and lost, in other words. And he just smiled and laughed and said, I never lost. So here's a cartoon. Nobody tells me what to do or say. It's a politician talking. You can see Congress on the thing, and of course, he's reading it. Okay, number 4, the last question here. How does the national government attempt to regulate interest groups? There's 3 things. One is registration. That is, everybody who's a lobbyist has to file with the government, national government, saying, I'm a lobbyist. This doesn't work very well because a lot of people who are not full-time will be working for the organization that they don't have to register. There's a lot of holes in the registration process. The second thing is public disclosure laws. Public disclosure laws have to do with telling us where they got their money and how they spent it. So you got to put that down in writing. Again, there's a lot of violations of this because people don't define a lot of activity as lobbying. They'll say it's education, or they'll call it something else, so they don't have to include it. And then the third thing is limitations on the activities in politics and expenditures in politics. So interest groups are not supposed to advocate for politics, or not supposed to advocate for candidates or issues in politics, and they're not supposed to spend their money on that. They're supposed to be limited to just appearing before Congress to give information about what they think is what they think the policies ought to be. But again, so these are the ways they attempt to regulate: registration, public disclosure, and limits on the activities. But you can look at these things, all 3, and see nothing but loopholes there, and very few interest groups really living up to the law. Like, for example, there's a number of public interest groups, like I mentioned, Science in the Public Interest, and Common Cause is another one. And if you look at it, if you just look at like the public disclosure, Common Cause spends as much money on lobbying as does the oil companies. And if you look at that on its face, and it's ridiculous. It doesn't even come close, but that's what it looks like on paper. Why? Because the oil companies are not really reporting everything that they should be. Those laws should be much tougher, and there should be penalties and all kinds of things that should go with it if we were serious about this stuff, but we tend not to be. So I would just kind of conclude by saying that regulation of interest groups has been a failure, and you have these 3 things, but they're either not enforced, or there's not enough teeth in the law to be meaningful.